With our Tekno NB48 2.2 buggy now taking shape, it's time to finish up on the chassis with its final few mounts, although before we do that we need to get through the next two bags, L and M, front and rear shock assembly. Bag L contains the front shock kit, lots of small parts in this, so take care to empty its contents, making sure nothing is left behind in the bag. You'll need some thread lock as well as some O-ring grease for this bag, so with those to hand, let's get started. With the main shock body in hand, place the black rubber O-ring around the bottom threads, making sure it seats nicely down into the groove. Next, we can reach for our Delrin pieces and O-rings, which need to be greased, so drop the first Delrin piece with the hat facing upwards, a shock X-ring, followed by a small Delrin washer, another shock X-ring, and top off with a hat washer with the raised piece facing upwards. Before screwing down the cap, just so it's snug holding everything in place, don't over tighten just yet as we want to get the shock shaft through first. Talking of the shock shaft, we need to attach our shock piston, so drop a washer into place on the top of the shock shaft on the thinner end, then drop on the piston, making sure the writing faces upwards, after which we can secure using a single 2.5mm lock nut. It's easier using the shock tool to grip the shaft as you tighten. Before inserting into the shock body, apply some grease to the threads to prevent it from tearing any O-rings, before pushing through the body, and then wipe off any excess grease once through, making sure the shock shaft is nice and smooth. Next, we can go ahead and get the shock collar installed by first inserting an O-ring into position, before screwing it onto the shock body. Fortunately, I found this easy this time round in comparison to other vehicles. Finally, drop on a shock boot, after which we grip the shock shaft with the Tekno shock tool so it's not marked in any way, and proceed to install the rod end. And with that done, pop a pivot ball through the rod end. And with that, the shock body is complete and ready for filling. Repeat the exact same process with the remaining parts from the bag in order to construct the second shock, after which we can proceed to filling with oil. So with the 500 CST bottle handy, we go ahead and proceed to fill the shock with oil, after which we pump the shock shaft from bottom to top around 5 times. Now we can prepare the cap by inserting an O-ring so it sits far inside the cap, and I also like to add a few drops of oil into the shock cap here, after which we can proceed to installing the cap onto the filled shock. At this point, proceed to install the tiny O-ring to the bleed screw using some oil helps to avoid tearing the O-ring here, and going back to the shock, holding it at a 45-degree angle with the bleed hole facing upwards, press the shock shaft so it's all the way to the top, and while holding, insert the bleed screw into the cap until snug. Next, we need to pump the shock shaft up and down vigorously around 20 times or so in order to emulsify the oil, after which the shaft can be fully extended and the bleed screw removed, again facing upwards at an angle, after which we push the shaft all the way up again, and finally tighten down the bleed screw until snug. And with that, first shock fully prepared. After replicating the same process on the other shock, we have both front shocks complete. All that's left is to insert into the supplied springs, and insert a spring perch on the opposite end to hold it in place, with a 10mm set screw to secure. Finally, insert a shock cap bushing into the shock cap, and once repeated on the opposite shock, we're ready to mount to the buggy. When mounting the shocks to the vehicle, note that the slot in the spring perch should face the outside of the vehicle, so with that in mind, slide the shock cap onto the shock standoff, and screw on a flanged lock nut, complete with some thread lock to secure into place. The bottom of the shock is secured to the suspension arm with a single 18mm shock mount screw securing it into position, stock position being the inside hole. Note that the black screw is right-hand threaded and goes in on the left side of the vehicle, in other words the left side as the buggy is facing away from you. Repeat on the opposite side, so lock nut with thread lock up on the shock standoff, an 18mm shock mount screw on the lower inside hole, this one being silver and left-hand threaded. And with that, our front shocks are complete. The rear shocks in bag M are slightly different to the front, so it's a good idea to build a set at a time rather than get any mixed up. The shock body is slightly longer, and we have a 600 weight oil too, but otherwise the process in building them is exactly the same, so we won't cover the same process all over again, and as if by magic I've prepared them off camera instead. Again, we mount these onto the shock standoffs with a single nut, taking care to make sure the slot in the spring perch is facing outwards, and this time we're using the silver screw on the right side and the black screw on the left side of the buggy. And we are done. That's bags L and M complete, and both front and rear shocks mounted onto the vehicle. All feel perfectly fluid, and that's pretty much all the main parts of the vehicle built and complete now, and it's looking great so far. In the next part we move on to bag N, installing some extra parts onto the main chassis before completion.